Peace, peace, peace. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ray Douglas, and this is Black Future Month 2020 in partnership with the National Youth Agency. And at the finale, Protests, Pandemics and Prayers, I'd like to welcome you all those of you watching us on the live stream. We've got a packed session today, multiple speakers, influencers, and not the influencers that we hear about, but real influencers who are making a difference in the lives of people all day, every day. So we've got approximately six guests on who are about that work, not just speaking about it, but making a difference. So I'd like to thank you for thanking them all in advance, really, and starting with someone who I see is of those who are doing the work. I know her as Anita, but as you can see by her name, we can see the coping mechanism. So who is Anita Naya? Explain to everyone, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Ray. So yeah, I'm a social psychologist. I'm currently running a project called The Coping Mechanism, which is a Black and minority ethnic-led initiative to understand how people are coping individually in the pandemic, but also what the social psychology of that is. So how it's going to impact community cohesion, basically.
Wow. So it fits perfectly into what we're going to discuss today. As it says, the triple Ps: protests, pandemics and prayers. And essentially, that explains 2020 for a lot of people. We've seen the world change, the country change, our communities change, and some our faith groups, for those of you tuning in from the faith community. And it really is a time where, as humans, let's forget all the labels and our roles, as humans, has challenged everybody. So give us a bit of background why you went with the coping mechanism.
Yeah, and I'll get my slides up as well if you're ready for them.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so the coping mechanism, basically, I'll give a bit of a background. Our funders came to us at the beginning of this pandemic and they said, look, this is going to have a big impact on how we treat one another. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing its impact on Black and minority ethnic communities. At that point, it was back in March, April time when we were seeing that the death figures were higher for us. And obviously, there were institutional problems behind that got repressed quite early on. So they asked us to have a look at how people are coping between communities. So there's definitely a faith angle to that. And if I get up the slides, I can share with you.
Okay. And when we say we, are you specifically talking about BAME? Because we had a real in-depth conversation with Dr. Martin Glynn earlier this week around the concept of BAME. How was that in the first and foremost? How was that in terms of what was BAME for you?
Yeah, so it's a really important question, especially now, at the time when we're all dissecting what BAME is and the way that BAME's being used as well. So we found it really important at first to define what we mean by BAME. So we want to interview the three most affected minority ethnic communities by COVID. And we also want to interview the majority ethnic population, because often when we talk about BAME, and BAME research, we start researching what's happening amongst the ethnic minorities, and we don't look at where it's coming from. And there's that whole power dynamic there, isn't there? So we were really, really interested in looking at what's coming our way from the ethnic majority, if anything at all. But we wanted to see what the dynamic was there and how that might affect those of us who are maybe use the word marginalized groups. Yeah. And the other consideration we had there was, like, of the three most affected, we all have a post-colonial past. So we looked at South Asian, Black African and Black Caribbean. It was important to look at those three differently. They're still broad categories, but we looked at it as also degrees of things like displacement, which sort of, like, I guess in the post-colonial but less displaced groups like South Asian and Black African, there's a different dynamic to the high displaced groups like Black Caribbean. So that was important to kind of separate out and consider as well.
Okay. So I mean, we can, because we've got a 2-hour show, so there's loads of people who are going to chime into this. Let's start at the very beginning. What were the challenges?
So the challenges, I think really it was finding a way to look at our social psychology. And let me just flick these slides up now, shall I?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah, please do.
and then I can kind of show you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
1 sec.
That's better. There we go.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So the way we went about this was we set up a life diary online, and we had about 1,300 people respond to it. And what we were looking for in that was, how are we responding to the pandemic as a trauma? So some people might be like, oh, I wasn't traumatized by the pandemic, but in the psychological sense, trauma is when safety is removed, right? So we had a big change, like our lives completely changed, our routines changed, the people around us changed, we found ourselves at home. So we've treated it as a trauma. And what we wanted to see in people was, are you employing the kind of coping skills that can lead to kind of, I guess, community growth and bonding? Because not only bad comes out of trauma, right? We can build ourselves up after a trauma. But we can also respond in negative ways to trauma, and we can embed the trauma, make it worse, find it more difficult to live in. So we wanted to have a look at like those two things going on, and those things, they're not just about us, they're directional. So I've put here the trauma response. Our individual trauma responses to the pandemic, are also our community response, because it's not just about us. So if you look at the list here of things that we were looking for, on the kind of resilience side of things, there's like an acceptance of the situation, developing the ability to rely on yourself, but also building relationships that help you to understand the new normal and grow out of it. Spiritual resourcing is there, and we'll talk about that for the faith communities. So, trying to see the bigger picture, I guess, and religious communities are particularly good at this, and finding new possibilities in a new world. So these are all positive things we could be doing. And we wanted to pick up how much that was happening in the different communities that we looked at, the 4 different communities. Okay. And we wanted to look at the negative as well. So in just the same way the positive can help us as a community by building relationships and seeing new ways to be together, so can these kind of left-hand side, like the stress, the kind of negative responses. So denial of the situation means that nobody's dealing with it. Like kind of discomfort with yourself is kind of like not liking being alone with yourself, not being able to deal with who you are. Now you've had to stop. But also scapegoating. And I'll come to that, because I saw that a lot in the dominant ethnic community. So that affects community relations. And then I guess, displacement of your stresses and anxieties onto other things or other people, and just resisting the change that's happening, wishing you're in the past. So you can see how some of these things affect us personally, but they also affect our relationships, in our immediate circles, and in our communities. So it's really important to look at these. So that's what we went in and looked at through this diary. We had some qualitative questions just about, how are you making sense of it? What are you learning? What are you struggling with? But also some statements that we put out along these lines that people agree with. And we looked at kind of things like projection as well, tried to pick up that scapegoating. So I can share a few of those answers as well.
Please do.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that we looked at here is experience. So how safe were people feeling? What was the level of the trauma? And it's safe to say most people were expressing words that showed they were feeling traumatized, and most people said that they were feeling anxious, worried, or scared right now. And again, remember, this was in lockdown. So this is just who we spoke to. So it wasn't young people, but it will affect young people, because again, we're looking at the powerful group in terms of age as well as ethnicities. So
and these are the parents of young people, right?
And these are the parents of young people as well. Yeah. And they're the people who most influence what happens in our community. So that's why we went for this age group, because we were like, who's going to impact everyone else the most? And it's this age group, 35 to 60. We went for a target income of up to £99,000 per household. We had a range from financially insecure to financially secure in there. yeah, equal genders, and then yeah, the target ethnicities I've already spoken about. So that's who we spoke to in these diaries. And I'll just skip on to what we found, because I think it was really interesting. And I've given a certain lens to this for this talk. If anyone wants to check this out in more detail, as Ray knows, he's been on a podcast with us at the Coping Mechanism as well. Do go onto the YouTube page and listen to some of those podcasts. They're about half an hour long each. They go quite into a lot more depth. So here, the majority ethnic population, we notice, so on the kind of positive ways of coping, positive trauma responses, we actually notice, and this has been picked up elsewhere, a massive amount of gratitude and just realizing what we have is good. But on the negative side, we saw scapegoating and sort of just wanting to blame other people for what was happening. And that came through so strongly. And both of these actually came through really, really strongly in both the qualitative and the quantitative questions. So I'm going to give you a taste of it. So in terms of gratitude, and kind of what's being referred to now as enhanced empathy, we had a lot of people saying, when we said, what lesson are you taking from the pandemic? A lot of people saying, just appreciating what I have and noticing things. Like this person has been really bold and said, I noticed that I don't give my children enough of my time. The last person on this one has said, I need to put more effort into friendships and relationships. And people were really noticing other people all of a sudden during lockdown. And it felt like a great time. We did a podcast on this called The Power of Gratitude, right? And it's almost like this is the majority of the white British respondents didn't have a religion. And it was almost like this was the spiritual enlightenment. This was the spiritual resourcing, right? Just that appreciation, that gratitude, stepping back and seeing what they don't have. And this for me could be a positive. But we had this on the flip side, which we did not see at all in the Black and minority ethnic populations that we interviewed, which was, the difference was astounding. So there's a lot in here about how stupid other people are, just general members of the public. They're idiots, they can't follow the rules. I'm sure we've all heard that. And there was a lot about government at this point. Polling now shows that that's changed and people are more likely to blame public than the government, but at this point they were more likely to blame government than the public. But in any case, there's a lot of blaming going on here. And the blame did have, you know, a kind of ethnic angle as well. So some of it was about certain cultures. Certain cultures clearly disregard safety guidelines. There was references to Black Lives Matters protests that were happening at that time. So all the recent protests are really bad. All the effort we put in, nothing's being done about it. And you can see there's one on here which is quite extreme, but there are a few extreme ones. That my hate for the mainstream media and the Labour Party is so intense. And so you can see from these there are some really worrying directions for this blame, right? And we do another podcast on this called Government Communications and the Hot Potato, which is about, you know, this government were passing on the blame from the beginning. We expected to see it being dispersed through the communities. And we definitely saw it, but we saw it in a very, very racialized way. It was very much by the white British community, not always towards ethnic minorities, but we know that marginalized people often take the brunt of scapegoating. So that was worrying. So, but we had this kind of binary. I'm going to skip over this one actually, just because of time. We had this kind of binary where, you know, so these were statements we gave to people. People both felt like they could empathize with people more. So the second one, I feel communities are coming together more. All groups agreed with that. But also they worried that we're becoming more divided. So all groups, and by all groups I mean all ethnic groups, agreed that we are becoming more divided. And you can see this clearly in the qualitative responses from the white British communities. But it's just really interesting that there's this almost conflict there where we want to come together, but we are being pushed apart and we are taking on blaming. So yeah, and this person coins it really well. I think in some areas it's making neighbours come together, but in others it's dividing people, it being the pandemic. So it was a really interesting thing just to look at that from the white British community, and where, you know, you can see how looking at how we respond to the trauma, our trauma response, positive and negative, can impact on community relations. And we have a real, it made me feel like, and Ray, we've discussed this, you know, we're at a time where it can go either way. We can either make the most out of that empathy and try to build places to be together. We can, you know, we're going to be in a much more divided place. And we've already seen the politicization of movements like Black Lives Matter. So that's the picture for the white majority. And as I've said, I think it's really important to look at what's happening in the most, you know, ethnically powerful group. So I'm going to move on to the minority ethnic group now. So here I wanted to look at spiritual resourcing, because it's something that, you know, Ray, you said you're interested in, and I think it's for this conversation. So what did you say, Ray?
So when we were in, you know, we were in America last year, this time last year, weren't we?
Yeah.
And one of the words that they were consistently coming past my ears was spiritual bypassing, and you know, it was an interesting concept. But then I saw you introduce this into my psyche around spiritual resourcing. Can you explain to those who are watching what is spiritual resourcing?
Yeah. So and good question. So spiritual resourcing is, I guess, to put it basically, it's the ability to through a religious or a spiritual practice to kind of step back and see the bigger picture. So we quite often spiritually resource as people who believe in a God, for example, by saying it's in God's hands and it may be part of a bigger plan. So it helps us to just, you know, when you're in the trauma, you're in it, right? And you're feeling all the anxiety and stress related to it. And spiritual resourcing is a practice that allows you to step outside of that and look at it from the outside. It's also really, you know, that's a practice that works in CBT and trauma therapy as well. A lot of them rely on that, stepping outside and seeing it from the outside. So spiritual resourcing allows you to do that through a spiritual practice. Mindfulness works in the same way, so it doesn't need to be related to a religion. When we asked about it, it was, do you have a religious or a spiritual practice that helps you, that's helping you through the pandemic? But we see that much more in minority ethnic communities anyway. And there's really strong evidence to show that this practice, it really helps build resilience to trauma. The interesting thing here, so you spoke about spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is I guess the antithesis of that. It's when somebody says, you know, you're very keenly feeling sad or anxious or stressed or traumatized, and someone says to you, don't worry, you don't need to worry because God will make it okay. Or uses kind of religion to, you could almost see it as like, you know, there's mansplaining and there's religion-splaining. So spiritual bypassing is when you religion-splain to someone and it doesn't actually engage with what they're feeling. You know, spiritual resourcing isn't about denying your feeling.
Isn't there woman-splaining as well? I'm sure there's woman-splaining as well.
Don't.
But that's another live in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, look, but what we're saying is that people from outside that culture, outside that gender, outside that community, outside of that ethnicity, explaining to those within those spaces how you feel. Is that what we're saying essentially as well?
To say, like, I'm a Muslim, another Muslim comes to me and says, you don't need to worry, you don't need to feel anxious about the pandemic because God knows best. And it makes me feel really stupid for feeling the way I do. So that's spiritual bypassing. It's like, because you've got a religion, you shouldn't feel desperate or sad or
and can I just stick a pin in that? I only said womansplaining because I've got a real issue with the word mansplaining.
Okay.
And it wasn't a slight, but this thing about spirituality, because like you said something really profound there, we're not talking about necessarily around organized religions. You're talking about people's inner game, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I get it. And what came from that for you? What was the jump out moments from that for you?
So this was really interesting, right? So we were expecting these three minority ethnic communities to be using religion or spiritual practice more, and for that to be helping them. But actually, there was a really interesting thing, which is that we found it may have been helping them in some ways, and I'll talk about that. But there was also this kind of repression of emotions going on. And I'm going to talk about that as well, because it's really important for the way that we curate space, we hold space for the young people that we're supporting as we work through this pandemic. So let me just go into that. So, I mean, these are just some positive things you often see in communities with religion. And this was a largely religious group of people. So South Asian, Black African, Black Caribbean people were highly likely to agree or strongly agree that they had a religious or spiritual practice. It was the opposite for the majority ethnic group. They were highly likely to disagree that they had a religious or spiritual practice. One of the things you see coming from that often as well with religious practice, especially, is coming together and kind of community support. So we saw a lot of kind of the qualitative comments were about, I'm learning to help my neighbours more. Yeah. I'm learning that every job is important. People are reaching out, you know, and trying to build communities. That's a kind of nice, positive thing. And we can see here, yeah, I'm drawing on a religious or spiritual practice tendency to agree was that our 3 ethnic minority groups. I'm putting more effort into relationships. South Asian and Black African tended to agree with that. But then we go into the sort of difficult territory. The survey's making me think about things I don't want to think about. And I'm expecting life to return to normal very soon. So the third one could be a result of spiritual bypassing, right? Like, okay. We're not, and I don't know, that's an assertion, I don't know that, but it's that there was clearly, you know, things coming up for certain groups that they didn't want to think about. And there's other data points that show that for the other groups. And then this expecting life to return to normal very soon. I've kind of counted that was a denial statement, basically, because we were in lockdown and it was towards the end, and it was kind of clear to most people. And that expectation to return to normality soon is kind of a bit of a denial of the you know, what we're up against with this pandemic, which means that you don't deal with it emotionally. Basically, that's the importance of looking at denial. And then we had a podcast about this one, didn't we, Ray? We did this. We asked people to say what word, what one emotion expresses how you felt through this pandemic, right? And I'm just going to compare with you the majority ethnic group to the minority ethnic groups and see if you know what's going on there. Right, so this is a majority ethnic group. So just look at that. A few of those words that pop out. The bigger words are the ones that have been said more. Yeah. So the diversity of the words that have been used: anger, worry, anxiety, bored, relaxed, isolated. Okay? Now compare that to the South Asian response. What do we notice already?
Okay.
Fewer words, right?
So, yeah, fewer words and more around lack of hope, right? And
do we notice any aggressive words in there?
No.
Compare that to this. None, right? Yeah. None. So are we not feeling angry? Are we not feeling frustrated? And then saying this is Black African group, and take away 2 more words for the Black Caribbean group. Right? So we are really managing what we're saying. And I'm just going to leave it on that slide to say this bit, because what was really important here was that we're not expressing ourselves in this space, right? So where else are we holding back? And the other thing important to say here is, so a lot of the work I do is research with ethnic minorities. This is common to see, and it's a form of social desirability bias, and it's about us being stigmatized as minorities and not wanting to embed that stigma in spaces, right? So even when we've been given a processing space, we won't express things that embed stereotypes. So we're not going to say South Asian terrorist, you know, we're not going to say we're angry, yeah, Black robber, okay, whatever the headline is in the Daily Mail. We're not going to say that we're feeling frustrated. So we're avoiding words that embed stereotypes about us in the space we go into. And that is affecting how we're processing, right? Because if we're not sharing our full range of emotions, we're not processing properly. And it makes acceptance a lot harder, acceptance of the situation. Makes denial a lot easier.
So, I mean, as I mentioned at the top of the show, essentially these are the parents of the young people. So, you know, what would really be interesting is that replicated amongst the 13 to 21 or 13 to 19 category. Do you think there'll be correlation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It is a really interesting question. And the honest answer is, I don't know at this point. But if you think about the fact that, you know, these being the parents of the children, and them, I guess, setting the atmosphere in which things are discussed and explained, it does make you wonder how much is being spoken about at home, how much we just how much we manage what we're saying. So
totally
that's one consideration. And the other is, you know, I think the answer to that question is also, at what age do stereotypes stop you expressing how you feel?
Indeed. You know what? That's a perfect segue. I'm gonna bring in Lee Middleton, who's the chief executive of the NYA, into the live. Lee, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Ray. How you doing?
I'm well. Welcome, and thank you for coming on the show. And the vlogcast, whatever it's going to be called today or tomorrow. I assume you caught some of that from Anita.
I did.
And I know that NYA has been doing a lot of work generally amongst the youth sector around the realities of COVID, protests, etc. Were there any jump out moments for you? But before you answer that, tell us who you are. For those who don't know who you are, tell us about the NYA, and also over the last 6 months, what's been going on and what is the state of the youth sector in this country?
Sure. So, hi, my name is Lee Middleton. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Youth Agency. I'm a career-long youth worker since I was 15, now 42, getting grey. So the National Youth Agency is the professional statutory regulatory body for youth work. That's the official title, the boring bit. But essentially, we're the body that looks after all the youth work across England, setting qualifications and standards, lobbying, policy. We get involved in research and support all sorts of any aspect really that kind of improves youth work, and by doing that, we improve the lives of young people, because youth workers act and support young people down the line. So that's what we do as an organisation. Quite a diverse space, but very broad in what we do. But yeah, interesting role to hold. I've been here 3 years. So COVID has upended everything. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I'm looking at Anita's word clouds there. You know, I've heard those words over and over and over again from all sorts of people. You know, and the one of the challenges was the speed in which it all came about. So, you know, we were given about a week's notice of lockdown, but actually for young people, you know, it just happened out of the blue. School shut, and you're stuck at home, trapped in your flat or your house or wherever you live, and you can't see your friends. And we talked about. You need to talk to a lot about trauma. I mean, the harm, the pain that young people have experienced has been, astronomical and unlike we've ever seen, in a long time. And the speed and pace of that, and pulling the rug out from underneath young people, and the loss of their networks and their support mechanisms. So, we know, about 1 million young people would access youth services a year, but the research that we've done as part of COVID to make the argument. It shows that that's now 3 times the number of young people. 3 million young people need the support of youth services. And you asked me about the context. In the last 10 years, austerity, we've lost £1 billion of public money that funds frontline youth work. Whether it's run by your local council or it's run by a voluntary sector organisation, we don't really mind. As an we don't care. But £1 billion is an awful lot of staff. It's thousands of youth workers. It's hundreds of youth centres. It's those lifelines for young people. And the thing that kind of gets us out of bed in the morning is, so often we hear from young people that their youth worker, their youth centre is either the only trusted person in their lives or the only place they feel safe. And often, in more and more, picking up on yesterday's hunger issues, actually some of the times they only get fed properly and things like this. So, youth services are just such a vital lifeline for so many young people, and disproportionately they've been whoppingly hit as part of COVID.
Powerful and sad at the same time. I mean, look, today's session is called, Protests, Pandemics and Prayers. What are the challenges facing? We had a conversation about BAME, but for today's session, we're going to talk about BAME organisations. Yeah. And although I think we're all agreed, none of us subscribe to that term. But for those who are tuning in, who maybe not from the sector, they can just grasp. So when we're talking about black and minority ethnic, some of the groups that Anita mentioned, we are doing this in partnership as part of Black History Month, because we feel that as a youth, the youth sector is not just representative, because definitely representative in terms of service users and outreach workers and etc. But we've had conversations about this, and I'm sure you'll agree. The reason why we did this is because there has to come a time where we'll have to start look at capacity building black practitioners into policy, leadership, management, etc., even more than what's around. But let's stick a pin in that and then talk about what do you think the effect is this going to be on BAME / faith-led youth organizations? And there are very few big BAME youth organizations, you'll agree, right?
Yeah,
so in terms of the wider issues, how do you think it's going to hit them?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that the representation challenge is real. We recognise that, and we're committed and working with you and others to support us to address it. I mean, ultimately, the biggest challenge is finance. I think the hit on young people has elevated those needs, has elevated the requirement for that support. And the big challenges we've got is making sure that there is a youth worker at the end of the line to pick those young people up and provide that support. Finance is going to get very tight. We're kidding ourselves if there isn't going to be further austerity or further crunches or bigger demands on spend. The amount of money government's currently pumping out, they are not going to focus. I fear they won't focus on young people as we need them to. And actually, this is the generation that is going to pay the COVID bill off. They've got a working life for the next 40 plus years, and they will be paying this down for probably most of that. And we're not going to be investing in those young people. There's a policy void. I mean, there's a huge policy void, which what we're trying to sort of fill, which is very much focused on certain aspects of society and certain aspects of life, and is missing huge chunks. I'm bored of hearing about serious youth violence, because it's always seen we're not going downstream enough to look at the causes and the poverty and the challenges that the lives and society that young people are in. And I regularly hold senior civil servants and ministers and others accountable for that, and saying, come on, yes, 10 years ago serious youth violence has been around for forever probably, but it's escalated dramatically because you took £1 billion worth out of youth services. Before, youth workers would have been keeping young people in a safer environment, supporting them, and that's gone. So our challenge is multiple, and in terms of BAME, it'll be making sure those young people who completely disconnected and who feel that society doesn't have a space for them, that then they don't have a role, that they're not important, that nobody values them, is going to be a huge task to us to help give those young people hope, and recognize the brilliance that they've got in them and what they can do with it, and how they can maximize that.
Excellent. And one of the things that I what you highlighted in your work over the COVID period, and I'm going to bring Anita back in shortly to speak on that, is that not only has the lockdown stopped activities happening for a long period of time, but it was also prevented the lifeline of a lot of Black and Asian-led organizations to income generate, to fundraise. Some of the things that you highlighted were that a lot of people depended upon things like the London Marathon and independent fundraising. So those small community groups in around the inner city of the UK that were, they were already at risk in terms of sustainability. Is there a way do you think that we can look at that as a sector and say, well, hold on, we definitely need to get some support in for these BAME-led inner city organizations, whether it be the 2 part-time youth workers in the community hall, or just those outreach people that are doing five-a-side football but engaging and doing behavior management programs, whatever it is, because those are the ones who are working with some of the most at-risk young people in our country. And I don't like using the word at-risk either, but once again, for political sense. So what are your views around that? Do you think, is there anything that you've got in the horizon where you think, well, hold on, we really need to look at BAME organizations?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the answer is always yes to that question. The challenge is how and who you engage in that, and what is needed is the empowerment of those grassroots practitioners, BAME organisations. We need to be building infrastructure and building the strength of those organisations. There's work to be done in terms of supporting the networks of funders to get behind the challenges that young people are facing and then support them. And recognizing the unique and slight differences that BAME young people and BAME communities are feeling as part of this process. I mean, the slides that Anita was showing, really articulated that. And being able to talk about that really clearly is a huge challenge to us, because people aren't listening, and that's one of the problems. We got to make them listen, but you got to make them listen in a constructive way that they engage, and then they buy into what we need to achieve. So that's, there are big challenges. I mean, there are big challenges in our sector, BAME or not. There's fairly universal, but there's a difference and a disparity between the focus on young people from Black minority ethnic groups and others. There is not enough focus on that, and things like the Black Lives Matter movement it's been useful in one level in sort of shining a light on things and highlighting, hang on a minute, this is being missed. We were working on this long before some of these things, long before the kind of current wave, but it is about highlighting and challenging those stereotypes and perceptions that are not fair or accurate.
Solid. So Anita, back to you. So that report's saying to me that could really, I can see a 2.0 clearly, right, with the young people. Where are you taking it? Because you've got some great, I love the way that you've processed and brought it together, and you've got the whole, you've almost gone up in the drone and spoke about it. But what next in terms of the coping mechanism? What will you be working on?
Yeah, so I think the next thing we're doing, or right now, we're just talking about the results and really having some serious conversations around them, right? Because we've, in the podcast, we've hit on some really hard-hitting stuff. And I would actually, on the topic you were just talking about, I'd really recommend that people go to the YouTube channel and have a look at the one we did on social stigma and growth spaces, because there we talk about exactly those things about BAME leadership, but also BAME leadership, non-BAME leaders who really how they can kind of lean into the different languages we speak and different references we have in safe spaces. But yeah, I'd love to do a youth version next. So we're going to do a second iteration of this research later in the year around Christmas. With the pandemic as it is, we're kind of watching how things go, but probably December, January time. And we are looking at doing a youth version this time, as well as that middle-aged group. So
and you mentioned. Thank you. You mentioned something around in your report about kind of like post-colonial communities. You used a sample of communities. You didn't go, because if you'd done all BAME communities, it would have really been a longer piece of work. But one of the things that we were talking about it today actually in a meeting about the Guinness syndrome, that a lot of big organizations, the higher you go up the glass, the whiter it gets, right? Yeah. And this is something that, as I think. I'll bring in Lee as well, but also talking to you first. Do you feel, as someone, let's move away from your report about your other work, your wider work. What's your view? Because this is about leadership. What's your view in terms of going forward around visibility of Black and people of color in the youth sector? Anita?
Yeah, so there's a real barrier, I think, for us as minority ethnic communities, as individual minority ethnic communities, accessing funding. Because I feel, and this is important, because I feel like in the work I've been doing for the last 20 years, one of the most important things in my mind now is that we start growing our own spaces in which we can speak in our own terms. And I've seen Naila there in the comments, and she's spoken about maybe in some spaces we feel less safe to voice our anger, for example. So what are those spaces we can create where we do feel safe to do that? It's really hard for us to get our hands on certain pots of money because there's a language that you speak to funders. So long as the funders are white majority ethnic, they won't necessarily understand some of the language that we use. So, for example, if I'm to curate a space for a South Asian minority healing space, we use the language of religion and spirituality a lot. For a long time, many funding organisations haven't funded what they see as religious activities, even though with me, so that this is personal as well as I've experienced with other friends from ethnic minority backgrounds, that when you're applying for that funding, you use language like spiritual rather than religious, and it gets misinterpreted as religious, as an example. But we need that within our spaces to heal, to think, to speak. That's our language. So I feel, in response to your question, that I feel like we need to have movements set by us in which we invite the majority ethnic population. So we need to be able to establish spaces in our language and invite in the majority ethnic population to understand us too. I feel that that's the way we need to move.
Okay, excellent. And Lee, do you want to speak on that in terms of, historically we know that the youth sector, although it's supposed to be built upon anti-oppressive work essentially and practice, we clearly seen that there isn't the inclusion and the diversity and the leadership from Black and people of colour. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm taken by your comment this afternoon of the Guinness effect, the Guinness model, which is, sadly a reality that we want to change. There is a challenge in how we, when we look at the youth sector, that grassroots practitioner based, it's very diverse and more than matches the national picture. But as the further up you go, that becomes a challenge. I think Anita's hit it on the. It's about, for us, it was about creating the right spaces that are owned by those colleagues in an authentic way, in which they can have the dialogue that they feel they need, and then being able to push that dialogue up, but be empowered to do so. So one of the things we're trying to do with the sort of equal equity program is to look at, how do I as a white man step back but allow others to step forward and allow their voices to be heard and be and we can amplify that, and then invest into that in an authentic way. Ray, you and I have just talked about this. We've not changed our logo to a black version for Black History Month or something, because that's tokenistic. It's the same as doing a rainbow for Pride Month, etc. We're not interested in doing that. We're interested in long-term systemic change where we empower and enable more BAME colleagues to be in more senior positions within our sector, and whether we have to invest in workforce and development or training, leadership management skills, mentoring programs, educating the broader sector that there's a problem here, that we don't have this has got to be resolved. And I think that's what we were trying to do this afternoon with colleagues. We had a sort of hour and a half workshop with just sort of 30 of the largest youth sector organisations, and we were calling this problem out, that actually this has got to change. We're appointing an independent external body to act as a watchdog for us, if you wish, to call it that, who will do an audit of our organisation and the sector as a whole, both parts. We'll publish a report annually for us, independent, totally independent of us. We'll fund it, but we'll call out the problem and mark our, we shouldn't be marking our own homework in this. We want somebody independent to be guiding us, but also holding us accountable for that. And we've been wanting to address this for quite some time. It's not a new issue. The NYA, interestingly, we created the Black Youth Workers Association years and years and years ago. It was, something the NYA built, and then, as we've often done, we build entities to represent people, and then we let them go as independent bodies. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore, but maybe this will lead to a refresh of that, or some, new ways of thinking. But we're committed to doing what is needed to propel, more leadership from BAME colleagues across the sector, on boards, leadership posts across the charity sector. It is a challenge.
And and that's important that you've gone on record and said that as a big organisation that NYU is, because no matter where you look now, this conversation is around racial justice. It's been around for a long time, but now it's hit a tipping point. We've seen this week what's happened at the kind of like, not the highest level, but people going into the public domain. Saying that it shouldn't be, critical race theory. There shouldn't be talking about white privilege. You shouldn't be talking about white fragility. But that's still, you cannot speak on behalf of a nation. You cannot speak on behalf of a community. And people have been asking on the live as well. I think you've answered it, around the capacity building of grassroots Black orgs, etc. And we look forward to seeing that going forward. I'm gonna bring it back to why we've done this program over the last 4 weeks, 3-4 weeks. And it's about having the conversations about some of the hardest subjects. So, at the very start, we talk about gender specific work with Cheryl Garvey. We spoke about Blackonomics, about financial literacy with Cypher. Dr. Martin Glynn earlier this week around BAME and deconstructing BAME. And he smashed it out the park as he does. Yeah, he smashed it out the park. But today's about the challenges going forward, and post-COVID is a bit disingenuous because we're not post-COVID, we're still right in the middle of it. But I feel with things like Christmas coming around the corner, half term tomorrow, you know, we haven't done the full cycle yet of the what's really going to happen. And come this time, come 8 months, not 8 months from now, we're going to start talking about summer, you know, summer programs. And I just cannot see, that light for young people. And I know you have the ear of certain people within, in suits, as we call them. Youth workers love calling people anyone in, not just like youth worker, the suits. But really, one of the, I think, and I'd like people to come on the live as well and type in what questions should be people like Lee and people who work as strategic organizations, and Anita with the work that she's doing. What questions should we be asking those suits, or not even asking, demanding of those suits, to ensure that our young people do not fall deeper into this, some of the fallout we saw from Anita. And Anita, do you still counsel and do all your other work around therapy? Is that right?
Yeah. So
and have you seen a change or a spike? What have you felt as a therapist?
So my counselling work mostly is with actually quite targeted to girls in gangs. So I'm not seeing anything particularly different, but that's just because of who I'm talking to. But yeah, if you speak to teachers, you'll probably get a good idea of what's going on there. Yeah, but I mean, I think it's interesting from the youth angle on this is the politicization of Black Lives Matters, which has been overwhelmingly a youth-led movement, especially so where I live, for example, and I've seen this in a lot of the more provincial places in the UK outside of London. You know, it's been groups of young people who've been organising to try and get better representation of minority ethnic communities on the curriculum, for example. And I'm a bit worried about how that's being turned into a political football now, and that how Black Lives Matters is being sort of made party political. I think it's quite concerning for these young people who've kind of stepped forward and stepped up and actually found their voice. So I will actually in the next survey, I'll be really interested in that angle from minority ethnic youth.
Excellent. Look, both, we could have just had this show between us, but there's loads of people I can see in the queue who want to chime in. Thank you for your time and your input. How can people get hold of you, Anita, online? Can you just share with the room?
Yeah, so it's on my my name here.
Yeah, okay.
So on Twitter, I'm at coping_the. On Facebook, it's at coping, and on YouTube, it's coping mechanism. So yeah, go on and check us out. If you get onto any of those, you'll find the other links. So yeah.
And Lee, thank you. And Lee, NYA is easily found on Twitter, right?
Yeah, at Nat Youth Agency, and we're on LinkedIn and all the other usual channels.
And I noticed something earlier in your feed that you were saying that you are happy to have open conversations with individuals, organizations, movements around racial justice as it relates to the NYA. Is that right? Did I read that tweet right?
You did indeed. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We know, you know, we're happy to engage. We're happy to be challenged. We're happy to have that dialogue. Come and help us improve. Come and help us learn and understand. That's what we're about. We're an educational charity. We want to listen and learn. We are investing in this stuff. We're changing what we're doing. We are recruiting new trustees. I've seen the comments. You know, we're working on those things. We've got our independent, you know, body coming on board as well. So, you know, there's a lot of work going on to this, and this is not a new thing. But yeah, really happy to be contacted and really happy to have a conversation.
Thank you, much appreciated, people. I'm just gonna let people know our next guests coming up shortly are Nalina Nadu, who runs a program called Resilient Me with the Children's Society, and your colleague Lee Abbey, who's the director of youth at the NYA. I'd like to thank you both,
thank you.
You know, for contributing and adding so much value to today's session. And I'll see you. Hopefully, you're going to stay and listen to the rest of the show. Thank you very much. Peace.
Thank you.
Yes, interesting. So I'm going to bring in the next two speakers. Good evening, peace, assalamu alaikum, wagwan, hello, kiale, balafini, kaifa halak, eskoran. We can go through so many times. How are you doing, Abby? Nalini, how are you doing?
I'm okay. How are you? It's good to be here.
I'm here. Yeah, it is. Do you know each other?
No, I don't.
No.
Good to meet you.
Well,
Nice
that's
to meet you
that's a
too.
first, because Abby knows everybody. So,
I think that was a
Nalim,
compliment.
yeah, it was. Of course, it was. I would like to get hold of your little black book. You want to introduce yourself?
Okay, so I'm Nalini. Currently, I'm working for the Children's Society on a program called Resilient Me, which is about supporting the mental health and well-being of young Muslims in schools. My background is in youth work and education. Previously, I had a organization called New Muslim Women, where we did a lot of youth work and worked with the NSPCC, workshops with parents and young people, things like that. I'm here today to mainly talk about our work at Resilient Me and the Children's Society. Yeah.
Excellent. And Abby?
Hiya, so I'm the Director of Youth Work at the National Youth Agency. Like you, Nalini, I've been a youth worker for a really long time and done a lot of projects specifically with young women, also with young people in the care system and also in education. So I'm really interested to catch up with you offline, actually, and hear a bit more about your projects, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We can change email addresses offline.
Okay, that would be
Excellent.
great. Yeah.
Excellent. And how much was you able to take in Lee and Anita's session?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what were any jump out moments for yourselves?
For me, I think it was really interesting what she was saying about spiritual resourcing and spiritual bypassing, because one of the things I've noticed when going into schools and talking to teachers is that when they're viewing culture, faith, and race identities, they're seeing it as sort of a negative, something that they need to overcome or something they need to convince the parents that, okay, it shouldn't be like that, it should be like this. And they're overlooking the benefits of spirituality, religion, and culture on the well-being and mental health of young people that they're looking after. So yeah, I think that is something that jumped out at me straight away. Also, what we were saying about fundraising. So our project has been massively impacted by the COVID crisis. I started in the beginning of March before lockdown, and the whole project has to be totally rethought because of funding and because of what's going on with schools, and that's been really difficult. Yeah.
And am I correct in that you kind of, the way that your project is set up is quite unique in terms of how it's resourced? Is that right? So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Our funding partner is BCBN, which is a Muslim organization that provides funding for projects, and they came up with the idea for the project, and the Children's Society are supposed to be the delivery partner for the project. So yeah, they've been really great and supportive as well.
So what's interesting, just to kind of elaborate on that, because I was at a BCBN event 2 years ago in London around anti-knife crime work, and they raised about $250,000 or something like that for anti-knife programs in London. Interestingly, the money was come through charity, but more specifically sadaqah and zakat. So for those who don't know what sadaqah and zakat is, which I know most people do, but let's revisit it. So what Christians would call tithes, wouldn't they? So out of the sadaqah and zakat, the mandatory offering within the Muslim tradition, and then obviously the voluntary offering, they raised £250,000 approximately to support anti-knife crime work. So that's interesting, spiritual resource in there in terms of supporting community needs. And one of the conversations I've been having with community faith groups is, well, you know, the difference between youth work and working with young people. So to work with your members' children is, some would argue, it's actually not youth work, it's working with young people because they're your members' children. Youth work would actually be leaving your building, going over the road to those young people who don't go to your faith space. You don't have anything in common with them, except that you want to help them move along. So I'm glad that interesting, innovative work around using zakat around mental health support for young people. That's beautiful. Abby, anything jump out for you from that first session?
I was really interested in the findings of the research around the different languages and the different words that people are using to express their experiences of COVID. I'd be really keen to see that taken forward to extend some research around young people, actually, because some of the stuff that we've been involved in with people like the Centre for Youth Impact and stuff has suggested that for young people, their vulnerabilities and their challenges and their difficulties during COVID have been massively amplified. So pre-COVID, you'd have been talking about roughly 1 million young people would have been identified as or labelled as vulnerable. And now we're estimating it's somewhere in the region of 3 million young people. And so actually projects like yours that are working to support young people around resilience and mental health are ever more needed and ever more essential, because we've got more young people experiencing more challenges with less resources and less support. And it's absolutely vital that we find innovative ways to fund projects to do such important work like you're doing, Nalini.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, the hard thing has been schools are not ready to have us in. They don't know what's going on themselves, and they're very busy, and there's no sense of certainty that you can plan, which is very hard. The other thing is that what you're saying about the research, the Children's Society do an annual research on the well-being of young people. I'm sure a lot of you know the Good Childhood Report, and some of the things that come out from that report this year were that children's happiness about their appearance has gone down consistently since 2007. But I think we need to look further into some of these categories and think, well, how does that affect BME children or young people? So young people are unhappy with their appearance, but how does that correlate with the beauty standards that we have? And how does that affect different races and ethnicities? Also, it's very intersectional. So we found that we have the second largest social economic inequality in Europe when it comes to young people, and that's terrible because, you know, we're the UK, why are we like that? But then we also have to think about the intersectionality of those things with race, ethnicity, and identity. And I feel like some of the research doesn't cover that or go into that enough, and it should. Yeah, so like you said, definitely more research needs to be done.
I think your point about beauty standards and things is a really interesting one. I was having a conversation with somebody earlier about social media and the relationship between young people's image and identity and what they're seeing on social media. And I think there's a really big connection, isn't there, between all of those things. You know, what does beautiful mean? What's a good body shape? What's a good skin colour? What should I be doing? It's all influenced by that. And I think that as well as more research in that area, there's definitely a need to do more upskilling of people around how to support and how to understand young people in that digital space and how to better meet their needs. Because, I mean, hey, I'm well over 40. I'm definitely not equipped to properly understand social media, you know, but that's the world that young people are operating in, right? There's a need for us to learn skills in relation to that, definitely.
And I think the need is also for culturally competent and faith-sensitive services, because even if we look at the outcomes for Black and ethnic minority young people, when they're going to services, are the outcomes the same? We often find that young people are having to explain or defend their culture or their religion to the people that they're working with. And young people, they're still forming those ideas and their sense of identity themselves, and they're not really able to do that. And that sort of puts them on the back foot, because instead of going through what they're feeling, what they're thinking about, they're having to defend and explain themselves. So yeah, I think it's important that we have more culturally sensitive services. Yeah,
I think
you know, interesting. Go ahead, Abby.
Sorry, I was just going to say I couldn't agree more, and I think there's two strands of that, isn't there? One is about how we develop and support services to grow that are culturally competent and culturally relevant and significant. So it comes back to that earlier conversation that Lee was talking about, which was around sort of capacity building and infrastructure and funding, and where does the money go and how do we provide that sustained support. But there's also a need for better resources in terms of physical resources that people can use to help them in their practice with young people. And again, back to that notion of adequate training. So it's, have we got enough people that can do the job? How can we skill the people that are there? And how can we create sustainability when there is, and amplify really good work that's happening to make it more broad so that more young people get that really good experience that meets their own needs?
You know, interesting to say that there's a you know, one thing I think a lot of adults have forgotten about the last 6 months is that the kids are watching, and it's like almost two parents arguing in front of little children, right? You know, all evidence leads to that it can affect the central nervous system of a child when they see parents arguing, right? And the central nervous system of the youth has been affected because right now there hasn't been clear leadership from adults around COVID. There hasn't been, you know, there's been a lot of, and it's because people are in survival mode. Let me bring you into my world today. I was doing a program in an SE MH school. You know, young children statemented, taxied in, taxied out, really kind of like challenging, not behavior, but just challenging levels of SEN. And we were there talking about the last 6 months. And he was seven, and he put his hand up to me and he goes, people are arguing about statues. And I said, what? He goes, yeah, people are arguing about statues. And I said, what's happened? He said, people are pulling down the statues. And I said, really, why are they pulling down the statues? And I thought, honestly, he was going to just stop there and say, I don't know. He said, because this is a 7-year-old young white child. He said, the people pulling down the statues weren't just black. There were white people pulling down the statues. And it's because those people who were those people who were on the statues, this is exactly how he said it, they used to own slaves. And that's not nice. It's a 7-year-old with SEN, the other side of the West Midlands. So the children and young people are seeing and hearing everything because we've all been at home. And even if they just catch one news item, and back to and you know, it was one of the conversations that Anita was talking about. What we're forgetting is the vicarious trauma that all this is going to cause. You know, definitely issues around identity and, you know, etc. But the vicarious trauma and the central nervous system of the youth. In terms of, so you said that since you've been running the program, Melina, you've had to almost like switch it like everybody else. Yeah. You know, Ray Douglas was not on StreamYard before COVID, right?
Yeah.
You know where you could find me, but I definitely wasn't on here. So what does that look like then? How do you roll out looking for the same impact? How are you working now as an organization that's trying to support young people's mental health?
So obviously, like everyone else, we're looking at online and telephone contact for young people. And with my specific project, we're also looking at maybe bypassing the schools. So working more with community organizations and faith groups already in those areas near the schools, rather than waiting for the schools to be ready to do things. I think that's the main things that we're trying to do. Yeah, I think one of the points that I wanted to make is that this really affects young people's mental health. Like you're saying, it affects their mental health and well-being. And when they go into schools or they go into spaces and their identity and their culture is not recognized, that affects how they view themselves, that affects their esteem. And another thing, talking to teachers, is I've been into schools and I've been talking to teachers about diversifying the curriculum. So we spoke about that briefly, and some schools and some teachers are really on board and some are less on board. So some, like I was speaking to some teachers and they were saying, but when they go to university, they need that shared understanding, because we need to teach them about the Bible, because if they're going to university and they're studying English literature, a lot of it will be biblical references and they'll be behind and they'll have to catch up if we diversify the curriculum and things like that. And they're like, we need these shared references, and it's our job to teach the young people these references, and that's why we can't diversify the curriculum too much. So these are the sort of issues that we're facing. Yeah,
and it's, you know, there's a big conversation about decolonized curriculums, not just pulling down statues, but decolonizing museums, curriculums, etc. Abby, you know, although you're at the NYA now, you know, you've been at the front line, you've been on the ground, you know what it's like to be working in a youth centre that doesn't have funding beyond 6 months, 9 months. You know, no, I don't think there's a youth worker out there that doesn't know about that youth program that doesn't have much runway. Now you're working, you still got your feet on the ground, and I saw you doing some stuff today. Was it around with Craig, etc.? Was it yesterday? But now you're working. Now you've all kind of overseen a lot of work. What are your feelings? with your total kind of grassroots youth work head on?
What about the funding perspective?
Yeah. So what are the challenges facing BAME communities in a I'm going to drop, should I drop post-COVID? No, yeah, in a COVID era.
Do you know, I think from a funding perspective, it's really, really hard across the board. And I think the problem is that a lot of people have had to diversify what they're doing. Nalini, you mentioned, schools are a bit anxious about, well, am I allowed to let people in at the minute, or am I not allowed to let people in? And that impacts on partnerships, and it impacts on funding, because if you don't get to deliver against the things that you were targeted to deliver, maybe you don't make your objectives, maybe you've got to give that funding back, and it's all that pressure people are really experiencing at the moment. So I think there's a range of things that people can do. Part of it is about being upfront and honest with funders, and being able to renegotiate and talk about, well, actually, no, I can't go into that classroom and do that particular session that we were hoping to do. But what I can do is provide this holistic support for young people to meet their wider needs around all of this. So that, like the report that Nalini said, that talks about body image, maybe. Can we diversify what we're saying we're doing to funders, because we're still doing the right thing for young people, and that's what it's about. I think also we were having a conversation about this today, actually, which was about people becoming stronger in their partnerships and being stronger in their connectivity, because actually there might be lots of little funders in your area that know each other, but you don't necessarily know all of them. So by connecting together with other organisations, not necessarily always to co-deliver projects, but maybe to share skills and resources to get the funding in the first place, it kind of builds that internal strength and takes a bit of pressure off the resources internally. And I think in relation to COVID specifically, one of the things that we were talking about is in every area there's a local COVID response group, and they have a responsibility to make sure that they keep the risk low and the services available for people during that time. And actually, youth work is an essential service. It's included in the Education Act, albeit that's a different conversation, but it's an essential service. It's recognised as needed for young people. If you look at the guidance that's out there at the moment, youth service is protected whatever tier your community is in, so 1, Tier 2 or Tier 3. So it's about getting into those conversations. And hey, we're here, and we're doing something really significant to support young people, which is going to take the pressure off all the other services as things go. So yeah, it's about being able to get into those local resilience groups and really make the case for why youth work matters and why you need to protect the rights of young people at this time.
And I've noticed through your weekly updates, youth centres are open, right? For the most part, those who can be, they're still functioning. They're obviously, these words, I don't want to use words like COVID friendly, but they're like COVID informed, right?
Yeah, so we have really good guidance that's out there that's really available. We're able to support people. There's certain things that need to be in place, that COVID safe environments, as they call it, but there's no reason why we shouldn't still be doing that work with young people. It's really important. They deserve it, and we should be able to operate in a safe way to still give young people what they need. Lots of people are doing things differently. Like Nalini, I don't know how you've had to diversify some of the work that you're doing at the minute, but people have taken online and gone to the streets and started working with different groups or smaller groups in different places. What's it been like for you?
I think for us, it's been quite hard because the project was envisaged as working with schools. So that was what we bid for, and that's what we were trying to deliver. But I think we've got to the point where we've realized we can't do that. Even if we do it online, it's hard to work with schools because we need logins for their own platforms and things like that. So we need to diversify and change the way we work. And I also think that one of the benefits of, I don't like to say it, but benefits of this situation is that we have been able to connect with people that you might not otherwise been able to connect with. We have been able to, because meetings are online, we are able to go to more meetings and connect with people that doesn't involve traveling around London or traveling around the country. And it's been a lot easier to connect with and meet new people. Some of the other things that we've done at the Children's Society is sending physical things to young people's houses. So like well-being packs, books, colouring, things like that, things that can benefit young people, or, you know, devices if they haven't got it, headphones, things to help young people with their well-being, sending it to them directly. Yeah.
The point that you made,
that's powerful.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, the point that Nalini made about being in meetings and meeting people that you wouldn't normally engage with is a really, really important one. Because one of the things that as youth workers or people that work with young people, we've not always been good at doing is telling the story of what we do and really shouting about the powerful work that happens with young people and how brilliant young people are, and being able to be in those spaces, like you said, that it's not about it, it's taking advantage of that horrible situation, but it's being able to tell people about the good work that's happening and the impact for young people that maybe wouldn't have heard that story before. So I think that's a really important skill for us as frontline workers to develop. How do we tell the stories of the impact we make with young people and communities?
Yeah, and I think youth workers and youth clubs in general have a really big part to play in helping young people recover and cope with lockdown, because the Children's Society did recommendations for post-recovery for COVID, together with Bernardo's and Young Minds and a few other national children's charities. And one of the recommendations were that schools should provide time and space for play, exercise, extracurricular activities, and social time for young people. But right now, schools are not doing that. We know schools are not doing that. And I think this is where youth groups and youth services can really come in and do that and provide that time and provide those spaces so young people can connect with each other. They can still carry on doing the extracurricular activities, and, you know, they can have a bit of a social life and something to look forward to. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We published a report earlier on this year about schools as well, Nalini, in relation to COVID. And it talks about the really important role that youth workers and community-based grassroots youth workers in particular have to play in the school environment and around the school environment. It's not just about this is formal education and this is our informal education. It's about how those two things should come together better to benefit young people.
You know what's really interesting? We working around the whole COVID conversation, and you know, in the backdrop is the whole, and you know, because sometimes when you quote Black Lives Matter, people automatically think you're talking about the organization, and what a lot of people are talking about is the sentiment. What a lot of people are talking about is the conversations that they've brought to the foreground, and you know, racial trauma is very real. And a lot of I just love when that happens, Abby. That just makes it know, and I'm gonna wave back, right? I just love when that happens. You know, exactly this, the fact that you know, we've removed a lot of masks. That's timely. A lot of masks have been removed. You know, COVID has stripped everything back for everyone. You know. But also on top of that, then we had the whole George Floyd situation, and then the youth rose up. Let's just say it as it is. The youth rose up, while the adults were arguing whether it's right or not. The youth went, you know what? No, you know, we're not feeling this. This doesn't represent what we stand for as young people. And there are all different, diverse young people out there. The reason why we called this show "Protest, Pandemics, and Prayers." You saw what Anita brought to the table about spiritual resourcing. We spoke about the pandemics, but the protests. This generation now aren't having the overt racism the way that some of the past communities would. You know, not to say that the elders would have it, but there was different dynamics. These young people now are calling it out early. They're turning up and they're naming, right? They're doing it like that. What's your view? And we're in Black History Month. And we can talk about Black history outside of October, but what in terms of social justice, Dr. Glynn spoke about it the other day, what from a young person's perspective and what you're seeing and hearing, what are the next steps in terms of responding to the whole conversations around racial justice and etc.? Feel free, anyone, to jump in.
Well, I feel personally, I learn a lot from the young people. Some things they understand better than me, and sometimes I see things, and like my daughters are 12 and 13, and if I don't understand something and I go to them, they can explain things to me very well. And I think the next steps is just supporting them in being able to facilitate that into creating positive change. So whether that's in their school, within their community, helping them come together. And a lot of them are really active online, but they might not really know how to navigate those things in offline spaces. So in their schools or in their communities with their councils and things like that. Abby, what do you think?
Okay.
I couldn't agree more. I was just going to say exactly that. I think the key thing is exactly what you said. It's about creating space. It's not about creating spaces. It's about forcing the doors open for young people to have the opportunity to have their voice heard at every level. Because you're right, they do know what's important. They are making a stand for the things that are really valuable and meaningful for them. And so, it should be our duty to move away and facilitate young people being able to take a lead in those really fundamental decisions that are made that impact on their lives on a day-to-day basis. We've just published the National Curriculum for Youth Work, and a really key tenet of that is like civic engagement. How do we create young people that have got the skills to be politically literate? Like you said, talking about something online is really valuable, but how can young people translate that to be talking about it in the boardroom or with the government or locally, nationally, with heads of big organisations? It feels like that's a responsibility of us, that are trusted to work with young people to support them to develop those skills in their spaces.
And making it accessible for all young people, because I feel sometimes it's the same young people. So if you go to an organisation or a school, it'll be the same ones that are chosen to represent the voice of young people over and over again. And it needs to be more accessible, that young people don't need to look or act or speak a certain way to be able to enter these spaces.
Yeah, I agree. There always used to be a term that was used, and you still hear it sometimes now, about, those young people are really hard to reach. And we always used to say, no, they're not hard to reach. They're just easy to ignore, and we don't have the skills to listen in the right way, as opposed to young people that, they're shouting loud and clear. We're just not skilled enough to listen. So definitely it's about how do we diversify the way in which we create spaces for young people. It shouldn't just always be those young people that are like, please, miss, I can do that, miss, in a classroom. Because that's not inclusive, is it? And it definitely doesn't represent all young people.
Yeah.
So true. Nalini, how can people get hold of you and find out more about Resilient Me? And how can what are your socials?
Okay, my Twitter is at Naila Naidu. You know what? I'll put in the comments, so it'll be easier. Okay. I'll put my email address in the comments as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. And because that sounds a very interesting model, using zakat and sadaqah to support young people's issues. And that could be everything, right? It doesn't. I mean, this occasion it's mental health, but that could be anything from homelessness to knife crime to gangs to So it's a beautiful model, and I wish you all the success with that. Abby, how can people get hold of you and some of the reports? Because I know you've been holding a lens to this over the last 6 months to the reality of what's happening with youth work. How can people get hold of you?
So I'm on Twitter. My name is spelled ABBEE, so it's at Abby at MYA, but I'll put it in the chat the same as Nalini. The best way to get hold of all our reports and guidance and that kind of up-to-date information is to join the MYA network. It's a free mailing list, essentially, but we'll send you all the updates and copies of all the reports. But I'll pop all that in the chat as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent, people. Listen, I thank you both for participating. You've added massive value to the session, and I will see you on the other side. Stay blessed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Come in, Ben Lindsay. Hold on, I had to give you the big announcement. Hold on. And Dr. Sylvia Smith, you ready? Come down.
Go on, boy. Go on.
What's going on? How are you doing?
Right now? Hold on, lick it right now.
You're good. How are we doing?
You know what? I'm just a great amount of content that people are providing, man. I mean, look, you know, it's rough times, man. But when I spoke to both of you individually, and I think I spoke to you earlier today, Ben, I was saying, you know what, why, and you understand what I say when I say this. I didn't us three to go last because I didn't want to just blacken the room. I wanted to end on a positive. I wanted to, because sometimes, you know, it's like historically how Black History Month was rolled out. It was very much, although it held a lens to history, it was very much a deficit model.
Yes.
Slavery, struggle, you know, in all the things that, you know, and as I've always quoted throughout this whole month, you know, slavery isn't Black history, slavery interrupted Black history. And I thought, when I was thinking about this real kind of last push at the end, because this is the last session on the last stream, one of the things I said is that no, I want to invite people into the room who are doing the work, who they themselves have been on a journey, you know, meaning I've been, you know, Ben, you've got, you know, a best-selling book that talks about, you know, for want of a better words, inequality within the church space, you know, difficult subject to write about, and we'll let you talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then Dr. Sylvia Smith, obviously you're a practitioner working at the Tavistock Clinic, but you pride yourself of not taking your foot and out of, you know, off the grassroots element of your work. And, you know, as Dr. Glynn spoke about this, about these ebony towers, because quite often when people of color see some success, they criticize one ivory tower and then enter ebony tower, right? You know, and as the Jamaican saying goes, you're not for dash your stone behind, you know, and you know what I mean. You got to let the ladder down for the next person coming up. So thank you both for coming on the show. So protest, pandemics, and prayers. What are the challenges facing BAME and faith-led communities in post-COVID era? But also, before we do that, I'd like you to introduce yourself, Ben, and then Dr. Sylvia, if you introduce yourself.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my name is Ben Lindsay. I am CEO of a charity called Power to Fight. We empower communities to end youth violence. And I'm also author of a book called We Need to Talk About Race, Understanding the Black Experience in White Majority Churches. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a Chelsea supporter.
Not your fault.
Yeah, it's tough times right there. In Frank we trust, man. In Frank we trust. It'll be all right.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Sylvia?
Yeah, well, let me just firstly say thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I mean, you know, earlier on there were some comments about how, you know, this whole pandemic and the whole kind of virtual sort of way we're connecting now. It's a sad set of circumstances, but I think ordinarily, how would we ever have got together? So I'm really thankful to be exposed to this kind of meeting. But I originally trained as a social worker, and it's almost 40 years since I've been a social worker per se. But so I've worked ostensibly.
Can I just say the cocoa butter serving you well? Can I just say that? Thank you. Let's continue. If it's 40 years ago that you've trained a social worker, then
yes,
either social worker's looking after you, or you know. But yes,
yeah, well, it's
not London water.
The cap is hiding a lot of sins. So of course, my trajectory in terms of my career has been mostly in social work. When I started out, I did start out as a youth and community worker because I was really committed to engaging with young people. But that was many, many years ago. And in a way, I was drawn to that because I wanted to work within the Black community. So the very first organization I worked for upon qualifying was a Black organization many, many years ago. And I've never really lost that involvement, despite the fact that I've, gone on and I've become involved or more involved in academia and so on. But at the moment, I'm very much involved from a career perspective in training social workers, training advanced social workers and social work leaders. And on the other side of my life, I'm still involved in community work in a very big way. Hence, my interest in these kind of activities.
Excellent. So the reason why I invited you both on is because you're doing the work. Simple as that. The receipts are there. You can see it there in the background, Ben. You can see, the other day, and I make no apologies. The other day, when we signed in another conversation, you signed in as Sylvia Smith. And I was cheeky enough to edit it on my side and put the doctor there. And the reason I said that was because they're not handing out PhDs, So a lot of the conversations that academics I've had with Black academics, is that two things Black community have been told for many years: get into politics and get into academia, and you'll see change. But any of the people who've got into those two spaces, what they've changed is the different types of racism they've faced. That's what's changed. Absolutely. And yes, doors have opened, but they've just been experienced to a new type of racism. Some of it with theory behind it, others behind, party politicalness behind it, if you want to call it that. So let me start with you, Ben. The two things you said: Power the Fight. What is Power the Fight? And tell us a bit more about the book, please.
Yeah, no worries. So Power the Fight was launched in 2019, January 2019, off the back of a couple of murders which happened in Southeast London. I'd worked in the field of youth violence, engaging with families for almost 20 years, youth offending service, community safety teams. At the time of these murders, I was working for a local church, and I was about to launch a church in New Cross, Southeast London. And these murders just rocked our community. It wasn't the first time we had young people, unfortunately, lose their lives, but Marvin Yard, who was murdered in April 2016, was someone I've known since he was one. I knew the family really well. And I think that, there's these tipping points in everybody's lives, these moments where you're just like, you know what, enough is enough. What do we need to do? And for me, it was all about system change. Like, working in this field for so long, it was kind of, I'm not against anybody who does the groundwork, who's doing the youth clubs, who, the classic idea of what youth clubs are and stuff. And that's fine. But how do you actually create system change? How do you challenge the systemic structures which actually cause some of these issues in the first place? So with Power to Fight, that was the aim, effectively to be the conduit between a co-produced, co-designed community response, and also engage with the policymakers, the decision makers, local MPs, central government, mayors of whatever city. And that's what we did. And how do we do that? We do that in 4 ways. We train and equip anyone who's front facing with this issue of violence which affects young people, and people like yourself and Craig Pinkney and various other people who I basically have the highest respect for, have delivered training. And we only launched in January 2019, but we've actually trained over 10,000 people. At the start of the year, it was over 5,000, but now, because we've gone online, it's increased our reach even more. The second thing is that we have online resources, and we've developed a podcast and a resource called Power Talks, which again, you've been on, Ray. And we're on our 3rd season. And again, it's just showcasing innovation and best practice and talking to people about what the type of work they're doing around this sector, and again, that's got thousands of hits. The third thing is that we provide not, I want to say a wraparound service, but we're not quite there yet. But we provide support for families who have lost young people, effectively financial support, signposting, advice, and we've, in the last almost 2 years, we've supported 14 families, which has been good. And then the final thing is all around therapy and culturally competent therapy. So my experience working in the field would be that families and young people and practitioners who would be traumatized and not getting the right support. And a lot of the time with the Black and brown communities I were working in, there was still this stigma about how do we actually engage with therapy. Practitioners were not getting culturally competent clinical supervision. Families were not engaging with therapy. Like CAM services were either didn't meet the thresholds or the waiting lists were too long. You know, young people weren't going anywhere near them. It was a lot of white middle class therapists, and I'm not against white middle class therapists, but my challenge has always been: are you culturally competent, and do you understand the context of the young people and the families that you're working in? So for me, I've always wanted to just do something about that. We had the opportunity to develop a pilot where I was bringing in, I've got a clinical lead who's a woman of color, and I was bringing her in and we're going to do some work. COVID hit, we had to turn that into a research report called the TIP report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's on our website. Maybe somebody could find it and put it in the chat. But that report basically demonstrated, we interviewed over 100 young people, in-depth interviews of 5 families who have been impacted by youth violence, and over 26 practitioners. And basically the report just demonstrated that there needs to be more culturally competent services out there. We are now in a position to actually develop and pilot a model of what we came up with, and we've got a pilot coming up. So that was a little bit long-winded. That was the clarity. That's what you call receipts. That's receipts. And then the book, I'll be a bit quicker on this one. The book basically came out at 40 plus years. I don't look quite as good as Sylvia, but you know, I mean, I'm 42 years old, and therefore the cocoa butter is doing all right for me as well. But yeah, it's 40 plus years of growing up in a white majority Baptist church, and then giving my life to Jesus in a white majority church, then leading a white majority, or becoming a leader in a white majority church, and then leading my own church in a white majority movement and serving a white majority church. And I just learned some stuff. Like you said earlier on, you know, you can get any title you want. The higher you go up, you still see racism. It just manifests itself in a different way. And the questions which always come from the Black community: why do we have a white Jesus? The church's complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. What about other religions? What about other faiths? The whitewashing of history. All this stuff is always been great in me. So I just decided to write a book about it and try and get deep into it. And if I'm honest, at the start of the book, I wasn't sure when I started writing it if I was still going to be a Christian at the end of it. I was just like, I'm not sure. I'm gonna go down a rabbit hole. What I found at the end of it, it's not so much God or Jesus, it's man's interpretation or humankind's interpretation of Jesus and God, which is the problem. But it's a good book. Get it. It's done all right, particularly in this time.
You know what? It's interesting. You know, when I used to, when we were doing a lot of the training, especially around violence reduction, it was very much done around the algorithm of what in Christendom they call the flesh, right? So the exterior, right? And I always remember this. I always remember someone at lunchtime, anytime I delivered training, someone would come to me and they'd say, "Ray, they need God in their life." And I always used to say, "But why are you whispering?" And right. And what was interesting is a lot of people of color, the code switching that they would do to enter into certain spaces, they wouldn't even be comfortable with talking about their spirituality, right? At a level, and even though it's very much front and center at their core. So when I saw you do the work then and have that conversation about spirituality, and now as a as a kind of, you don't call yourself that, but I'm going to say, you know, a kind of Christian-led organization, charity, that you've stood up and said, I'm a Christian and I'm going to reduce violence in my community. And then recently with your tip report, it's commendable because a lot of people leave their faith and their spirituality, whatever spirituality that is, whatever faith they follow. This isn't just about the kind of Abrahamic faiths. Right. Quite often leave it at the door, especially when they work in the public sector. Yeah. In those spaces, it's like, oh, it's almost like, you know, you got bike racks. They need to develop faith racks. Yeah, you leave your faith over there, and then there's a smoking shelter, right? There's a faith shelter. So that report speaks beautifully to the conversation I would like to have with Dr. Sylvia Smith. So you're based at the Tavistock, is that right?
Yes, I am. I'm based part time.
Tell the viewers, people who tuned in, what is the Tavistock Clinic? What is it?
Okay. Well, the Tavistock is the the home of Sigmund Freud, if you like, in as much as wow. It is a center of sort of psychoanalysis and systemic clinical approaches. There's a huge education component to it, which is the bit I work in. But the place is populated with psychiatrists, psychotherapists, psychologists, and meets the needs of married couples, families, children, young people with sexuality issues. It is very much, well, as described, I think it hasn't had a great reputation for meeting the needs of Black and ethnic minority people. However, there are individuals that have been employed to specifically look at those kind of issues. So you have a few of us who are from the Black and ethnic minority community who are sort of, I don't know, surviving in the environment and trying to give a voice to our experiences and the experiences of our people. So it's a very.
Did you see what I just did?
Yeah, no.
I just added another therapist. I added a therapist because you needed backup, because not that you needed it, but there's something that you said there, which it was shorthand for not just where you mentioned, but it's shorthand. I read in, it can get lonely.
Oh, absolutely.
And for those who, when you're a person of color in white majority organizations and spaces, it can get lonely. So I'd like to, I invited Anita, who is a therapist, and also I was watching her off screen while you were speaking, and as soon as you said a few words, it must have been therapy language. She sat forward, and then, you know, so I thought I'd add it to the stream. Anita, welcome back.
Hi,
the research that you did. I'll let you therapist do some therapy, love.
You know, I was just saying on the private chat, I said subtly, Tavistock, what a challenge. I was trained by the Tavistock. They used to run the course at East London University, so that's where I was originally trained. And I went to Muslim Youth Helpline, which was just around the corner from there. Originally. So yeah, I'm really curious as to how you're getting on there. I had lots of interactions with the Tavistock, and you know, this is going back about a decade now. I've always felt that they need that kind of opening up to different understandings of how humans process and how we process through faith as well, right? Like the spiritual resourcing stuff for me is really important.
I mean, what we've just been through this evening in terms of people's contributions and what's been shared here, I would just love to take that to the Tavistock, the entire thing. Because, I mean, in many respects, you know, we're still struggling. You know, the organization, the institution is still struggling. But in the face of what's been happening in the wider community, there's no escaping. There's no escaping. And so we're in the middle of a thing right now. I'll say no more on that, but we're in the middle of a thing. And yeah, we're sort of wading through it, you know.
But do you see, so whether you believe in pre-decree, serendipity, fate, look what just happened. So Ben, you've just done the report on therapeutic practices within the community. We've got Dr. Sylvia Smith from Tavistock, and then we've got obviously Anita finish the report around the coping mechanism. And I assume that you approach that report, Anita, in a trauma-informed way, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So we were also looking for the post-colonial trauma that we carry with us. So how does that come out? And that goes into all the how we kind of code, and we don't say how we feel, and we know what not to say. And that comes out in the therapy room, as I'm sure Dr. Sylvia, has experienced and probably very intensely. So that was part of the thing, was let's have a look at what we carry with us into today, because we're always being reminded, aren't we? Even, we're people who are conscious of it, but even subconsciously, we have some conscious cues about our role and place in society that come from the history that we know through our parents and our grandparents. There are certain things we come to expect. The majority ethnic community, I think, often refer to that as a chip on our shoulder. The chip is not a chip, right? It's something that we're carrying. It's a backpack, if you like. That's our trauma that we're carrying. We know how some things end. Some things, some responses to our behavior, some responses to our being. So all that comes into not just the therapy space, but the spaces that we hold, which is why it's really important that, this point that was brought up earlier when Lee was on talking about the work of National Youth Work Agency. It's why it's really important that Black and minority ethnic people, how we want to term that now, from different backgrounds, are able to be involved at those levels that you were talking about earlier, Ray, and set the tone, know the language, understand what traumas different post-colonial communities especially are carrying with them.
I mean, I think the whole the George Floyd thing, in many respects, it was horrendous, but it was not surprising to those of us from this communities. But I found within the walls of the Tavistock, and I don't quite know if it's also to do with the universal trauma of COVID, but they were extremely sensitized to that whole situation. And whereas there were certain things that were not necessarily discussed previously, they're being discussed now. And it's extremely painful. So it's a sort of a situation where what is going on outside can no longer be kind of like ignored, if you like, to some extent. So yeah, these are interesting times.
And back to that old adage, don't worry that children don't listen to everything you say, but worry that they see everything you do. Where everybody's work here today is connected to how we support young people going forward. It's interesting because COVID was the only thing that stopped the culture of trap music for a few months. Because it's hard to talk, some of the content in trap music didn't speak, not COVID, sorry, George Floyd situation was the only thing that stopped, that culture of promoting violence, because in the middle of all that, it raised everyone's consciousness. So even trap rappers, who quite often their content is around violence, not every one of them, but most of them, that you notice their content changed, and was talking about, they were even saying things like, I'm going to put my violence on hold and I have to address this racial justice issue, right? I'm translating it. So going forward, to speak to what today's show about, in terms of you, and everyone, please feel free to chime in. What are the challenges going forward, and how do we future-proof our youth? When I mean our youth, I mean all youth, and then within that, the youth of that look like us, speak like us, pray like us, share the same histories. So all youth, but specifically within that as well, Black and minority ethnic youth.
some of it stems from what I've already heard people say, because I'm in a complete agreement. We have to turn a corner, and I think we have to encourage and support more authentic dialogue, because for far too long we've been walking around with these sort of masks, or code shifting, and I mean, who isn't fed up with all of that? And I think perhaps our young people are a bit fearful, because this potentially has implication. I mean, we've got a situation where resources are constrained, and they're getting even tighter. Who is going to suffer more? It's going to be our young people. So they're conscious of that. What they may really think, they're hesitant to share that because they don't know what implications that's going to have. But we, as the older folk, we know, and I think it's our role and responsibility to create, encourage, support the safe spaces that our young people need to kind of express themselves and to share how they really, really feel, and then think through how they're going to kind of move forward. And I mean, that's certainly something, a message I'm taking from our discussions tonight. That's one thing.
And it's opening up those spaces for that as well. Ben, would you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, Dr. Sylvia. I think there is such importance about an intergenerational conversation. So I think somebody said it earlier on, that the protests which we've seen around Black Lives Matter, it feels like it has been led by the younger generation, and I think that is good. But I think also we've got to still work out a way where we can have that dialogue as slightly older people as well, and support, not take over the conversation, but support and guide. And I don't know if historically Black and brown communities have done that well. So it's something which I think we need to improve on. I think in terms of how we protect our young people, we still need to have the systems conversation, because we only have to look at what's going on in the press recently. A young Black footballer has attempted to try and get free school meals and it's been shut down, and that is just a compassion and love conversation, and the system in charge of that conversation seems to be devoid of any of that. So it just goes to show that there is still we can protest on one level, but until we can actually somehow impact those decision makers to really support and help us, it's a problem. And then the final thing I'll say is that like most of us, we've probably been brought in and called into multiple diversity and inclusion conversations over the last 5 to 6 months, and I think the thing what I always say in those conversations is that if you really want culture change, then we're going to have to do what I would call a AAA analysis. We're going to need to audit ourselves, our organizations, but our hearts as well. So there needs to be like an audit of where do we actually sit and stand around this conversation around racial injustice. White majority culture need to do that. The second thing is that the second A is the awareness piece. We're going to have to create those spaces where the Black and brown experience, as James Coney, the Black American theologian, said, allow us to go into the river of the Black experience on a regular basis in a safe space. So there's an awareness piece, and then the final A is what I would say is the action. Now, not like just a symbolic approach to this, but real substance. So how do we create measurable, sustainable targets which really will benefit our communities, not as pie in the sky talk? And I think with that AAA analysis, that will develop a culture change for our families, our communities, and our young people.
Yeah, that's solid. Nita, do you want to bolt onto that?
Yeah, I think I probably agree with what you're both saying. And I think, I don't know, in my mind, when you asked the question, I thought, actually, we're facing a challenge right now, and it's a challenge that young people are uniquely placed to respond to. And that challenge is that the ante is being raised on Black and minority ethnic awareness. So Black Lives Matter has been politicized as a party political issue. The movements associated with it and the demands of it have been associated with extremists. So we're seeing the ante rising, again, right? And we know as older people that this is something that we'll always see. So there are kind of ebbs and flows, aren't there, in kind of racial pressure and racial oppression that we recognise historically. So then where do young people come into that? They're uniquely placed to have the conversations that need to be had with patients. You know, Sylvia and I were just exchanging looks about it can be tiring sometimes to have these conversations. Young people, I find, still have the energy to do that. They have the energy to engage. They have the patience to hold dialogue. And I think, you know, just what you were saying, Ben, you know, that there are methods that we need to apply, and maybe as older people we can kind of do a bit of the educating around power structures and methodology. And I've just asked to have a link put in the comments actually on the podcast I did with you, Ray, and another great person, Abdul Rahman Malik, on some of those methodologies, social stigma and growth spaces. But I really feel that young people are in a strong position to face the difficult task of bringing us back, really, and engaging conversations that kind of bring majority ethnic population into our context.
Yeah,
interesting. I mean, because one of the conversations is I was listening to an interview by Melina Abdullah recently, who's one of the chapter leads, Professor Melina Abdullah from California State University, is one of the chapter leads around BLM. And like I said at the very start of it, BLM, the sentiment, not the organization, but she's obviously from the organization. And she has a real interesting take on white allyship, real interesting one, like, you know, friends of, allies, you know, not just being anti-racist, but and I'd ask anyone to have a look at that interview. It's an interview with Talib Kweli on his show, and she talks about, you know, the fundamental role that white allies have in supporting racial justice work. Now, that doesn't mean about banners and posters. That talks about, I think she's more referring to the spaces that they occupy and the positions that they occupy, and which, as I mentioned earlier to some people, that alone is a hard pushback as well, because some people are not prepared to relinquish power.
Exactly.
Right? They're not prepared to anytime soon, right? Not prepared to relinquish power. However, we're from a different generation than our parents. So, you know, not my dad wasn't really one of a person to kind of like, you know, cower and lower his head. You know, he often talk about running battles with the Teddy boys, you know, overt racism. But this new generation that come after us, they will call it out early, really early. Like, you think like, that's a bit early. Even the call out was a bit early, right? But because they share that intersectionality of youth culture, where me and Ben speak about this all the time, you could close your eyes in certain parts of London, and if they brought, Dr. Glynn spoke about it the other night, if you brought 4 young people in from different backgrounds, you couldn't, unless you've got a trained ear, you couldn't tell if they were African, Afro-Caribbean, or even, you know, because the youth culture is so close now. But do you think the youth culture that we're seeing now also is underpinned by more diversity than what we saw? You know, did you have, like, what I'm saying is that if I go north, far as north as Hull and those areas now, the young people dress exactly the same as the young people in East London. They dress the same as those in Birmingham.
I think you're right. I think it's different for different people. So me growing up in Southeast London, my friendship group, my generation, it was quite diverse actually, because we had maybe pockets of white areas and black areas, but to be fair, because my parents and grandparents came here in the 50s and 60s, by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, it's pretty mixed up. And you know, there's an example. The first time I heard about Snoop Dogg, the rapper, was from my white mate who lived down the road, and he recorded me a tape, and he drew the cover and said, "Listen to this rap," and I'm like, "Who's this?"
Shame on you.
Shame on me. Yeah, I know. It was the beginning of a slippery path, but like, it just goes to show that actually there is. But I think you're right, and you've said it before. Ray. It's now the dominant youth culture. There's a dominant youth culture where you can't tell who's who, what's what, everybody can engage. And I think that's a lot to do with media. I think the way technology has changed in terms of the artist to listener, that proximity has got closer. In the 90s, I'm listening to Biggie Smalls, but I'm in Southeast London and he's in Brooklyn. I'm not necessarily going to see that in my day-to-day. Nowadays, the person on the estate is charting. So if I had that every day, I'm saying, oh, that guy I know has just gone number one, or that guy I know has just got an album deal, I probably would have attempted to have gone down that route. And I think we've got to look at those type of things. The proximity's changed. Technology has meant, you know what it's like, Ray? Without exposing, your incredible hip hop history as an artist yourself, you know that studio time, videos and all that would have cost thousands of pounds back in the day in comparison to everything you can do in front of you. We've got to understand how things are moving now. And that just means the game has changed.
But can I also say, another thing, whilst I entirely agree with that, but what I also think is that a lot of our young people are also acutely aware of white privilege, right? And that's something I'm hearing a lot now. They're acutely aware of that. Those who are, for instance, trying to get jobs and trying to make their way in life and so on, they're getting those knockbacks and they're kind of conceptualizing where that's coming from. Sometimes they see their white peers who have made it or are making it, and they're still on this sort of glass ceiling type kind of thing. I'm talking about the ones in their 20s now, which is probably a little bit old.
Yeah. Do you think, just on that, Sylvia, do you think that is something you've seen change post George Floyd, or is that even leading up to that?
I got before, leading up to it. It wasn't just post George Floyd. I think it's always been there to some extent.
Okay, because the only reason I say that is because I know, so my book came out July 2019, and I remember talking to some of the black and brown friends I have, or younger people in their 20s, and some of the stuff I talk about was my experiences in the 80s and 90s growing up, which was almost life-threatening. And a lot of them at that point were like, you know what, Ben, I get it, but I can't really relate. So I'm like, all right, cool, no problem. I'm not expecting you to. Post George Floyd, the same people have kind of like switched. They've become like, suddenly overnight, it's like they become more aware, more heightened. And it's like, no, but I can totally relate. And I'm like, whoa, okay.
Could be some of the repression that Anita was talking about, you see?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's fascinating to see how things have just changed very quickly for some of the people, young people I've connected in with.
We have to survive, so we will turn a blind eye to some things, and I'm sure that happens. Well, it certainly happened to me, and I'm sure it happens to lots. And then, of course, this comes and hits you straight in the face. And COVID.
And the secondary trauma, obviously, what a lot of young people are now going through is like, oh, okay, I'm seeing this on a regular basis. So yeah, it's a really good point.
You know what? We could go on for hours, you know that. You know what we like when we start reasoning. I mean, me and Nita, we were in America this time last year, having long conversations, with a lot of different issues. And, one of them was the cultural differences in America compared to us. And sometimes you have to leave England and Britain to realize how British you are.
Yes.
Ironically, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. I'm going to do a quick Desert Island Discs, but it's going to be to round up the stage session. I'm going to play a tune, and I want you to process it for a few seconds or so on. And I want you to think what comes to mind. Is that okay? You ready?
Sure.
You sure? Can you hear it, yeah?
Just a bit.
It's coming.
Okay.
Is that Erica?
It is Erica. And whether you love her or you think she's a space cadet, it's Erica Badu, right?
I was playing some of her last night, actually.
So a lot of it is around identity, right?
Yeah.
And in whose image that we're made in, and etc. And you know, some people say the mothership's not coming to deal with some of our issues, right? But what I would say is, what comes to mind when you think and hear something like that?
What it
Well,
reminds me of.
Yeah, please go, Anita.
I was just, it just took me back to being a teenager. So this is the music I listened to: Erykah Badu, Lauryn Hill, Fugees. That would be my kind of like, when I look back now, I'm like, that's my processing music that touched on so many different things for me, and which was interesting, right? It goes back to what you and Ben were talking about in terms of like this super diversification of society, because that's not an Asian artist, but there's a lot in there that I understand about spirituality and displacement.
Yeah. And I'm going to remind you of something as well. We were driving past Alcatraz prison, and you were talking about how many mics. When you're talking about, I remember that driving past that bridge, Alcatraz prison in America, San Francisco, and you were talking about how many mics. That always stuck with me. Ben.
Yeah, I mean, that album's important to me. It reminds me, I remember exactly the place I first heard it. So I was at uni at the time, and we were actually traveling to an Afro, like Caribbean and African society gig in Birmingham, and this was being played on the coach. And I was like, what is this? And someone was like, oh, it's Erykah Badu. And it's just, for me, it became the antidote for a lot of, you got to remember that time is all the bad boy puffy era. You know what I mean? And I think the album came out maybe 96, 97. So it's either like post, just after Biggie was killed. And, I think we're all a little bit shiny suit out, and then Badu drops, and it was like, oh wow, now this is what I need. So for me, it was an antidote, very powerful. I'll be a bit controversial. I actually think Mama's Gun, her second album, is a better album, but that's just, that I don't want to get into that. But yeah, it was good. Yeah, lots of good memories.
And I just pictured you in the full red leather suit, man. The bad boy one, the top and bottoms that you have to climb into, the jumpsuit. Don't do that again, man. Don't do that again, bro.
From South East London, I couldn't get away from that, bro. There's no way I could get away with that, bro.
You should allow that. You should allow that. Interesting. Yeah, interestingly, I was playing some tracks yesterday, doing my little DJ thing, and I was playing Erykah Badu, Lauryn Hill, India Arie, all these people who have something substantial to say about our identity and so on. I mean, these people. I mean, I'm sort of a young person of the 70s, right? But then I began to, I think, know myself a little more as the 80s came, and the 90s and what have you. So there was a lot that came after my sort of formative years that taught me a lot in terms of my blackness, if you like. So yeah, those were
beautiful.
Interesting.
I just got you all reminiscing. Sorry, I just wanted to end on a positive one. Listen, people, thank you very much for this evening. It's been great. Let's just go back. We've had Anita and the coping mechanism. We've had Leigh Middleton from the NYA. We've had Abby from the NYA. We've had, Resilient Me in that program and talking about that. We've had yourself. So we've had, in 2 hours, we've fitted in a lot. And I'd just like to thank you, Arf. I'd also like to give a shout out to Milka, who's behind the scenes here, about 120 miles away from me, doing all the production. So, when people are thinking, how's that happen? Yeah, Milka, big up Milka. These are the unsung heroes. These are the soldiers who put the shift in that, and I just kind of like turn the light on and press play. But thank you, Milka. People, this is Ray Douglas, Black Future Month 2020. I'd like to shout out the NYA who's making it happen. We've heard Leigh, as a chief exec, go on record and say that they're committed to supporting Black practitioners into leadership capacity building. and management. I didn't say that, he said that. So that just shows you that there's an appetite out there for organizations, big organizations as well, to do this. I'd like to say, everyone, look, we can talk about Black History outside of October, but I think this month's been a different one for us. And I'd like to thank all those people who've contributed and yourselves. Love, peace, and hair grease. I'm signing out.
Peace.
Thank you.